Hello, everyone. This is the RF Factor podcast, episode number 10, with Pete Gagliardi and me, Ray Gadetti. Pete, how you doing?
Hey, Ray. How you doing? Hey, look, nice to be back for another RF Factor today. We have another good one lined up.
Yes, we do.
Yep. And just for everyone's own edification here and background, the letters RF stand for relentless follow-up. It's a key factor when trying to implement new policies and programs within an organization. But it's often the most difficult one to sustain. You know, you're driving your new program down the highway, and you got to be looking in that rearview mirror to see from whence you've came, right? Are those new policies and procedures still standing back there? Are they operating as intended? So what we try to do in every RF Factor podcast, as you know, Ray, is to, ferret out the key leadership principles from the experiences of our guests, where the rubber meets the road, and discuss how they could positively impact change for the better, not change for change's sake.
Very good point. Yeah. And, interestingly enough, with our guests that we have coming on shortly, this notion of looking in the rearview mirror brings on sort of another connotation, and that's sort of risk management. And when I speak about risk management, and of course our guest is going to speak more to it, is risk to a law enforcement organization, right?
And in addition to that, this looking in the rearview mirror analogy, I think. You have to be at good odds with the person staring you back in the mirror.
Very good point. Yeah, very good point. So, folks, today we're going to be joined by Thomas Martinelli, former Detroit police officer, licensed attorney, adjunct professor. Tom is currently a police academic and trainer who specializes in constitutional policing, police ethics, intelligence-led policing, risk management, and here we go, reducing overall police misconduct. That is the risk management piece that I was sort of describing. Tom recently published a book. Okay, he was kind enough to send me a signed copy. Okay, yes, I like it.
Hey, what am I, chop liver here? What? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, he wants you to buy that.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So the title of the book is Deterring Unconstitutional Policing: What All Cops, Civic Leaders, and Citizens Should Know for Improving Police Community Interactions and Reducing Civil Liability. Hey, look, now more than ever, Tom's insights in this realm are vital to how the police, as well as the expectations from the community. Now, look, I've been fortunate, and I don't think you knew this, Pete. I've been fortunate over the years to have taught alongside Tom with the Institute of Intergovernmental Research as we delivered an intelligence-led policing training curriculum throughout the nation for the Bureau of Justice Assistance. I would usually, I don't know if I was lucky, okay, and I say that tongue in cheek because I'm sure Tom is going to speak about what it's like when a law enforcement audience finds out that someone's going to get up there and talk about constitutional law, right? But I can guarantee you, after you hear Tom today, you he definitely is energized and energizing to the audience. So he would always leave me with a crowd that was always ready to go. So he definitely put me on my own game. But I always followed him for some reason, most of the time in the agenda. And I would always get there early. So I would get to sit and listen to him speak about constitutional issues as they relate to policing, police professionalism, intelligence-led policing. Hence the reason why I thought about bringing him on our show, because he's entertaining, but he's extremely insightful. I was also fortunate enough, I don't know if he remembers this, because he's authored so many articles for for a lot of different publications, to include IACP, the Police Chief magazine. But I did have the opportunity, if he remembers this, to co-author an article, and it was about intelligence-led policing, looking at it from the operational perspective as well as from where he sat, strategic perspective in terms of making sure as organizations were advancing intelligence-led policing, they were doing it with an eye on doing it in a constitutional manner. So I'm going to bring on, or we're going to bring on Tom, and put your seatbelt on, because this is going to be fun. Tom, how you doing, pal?
Wow, Ray, way to build up the audience's expectations. Thanks. I feel like I got to do a dog and pony show now.
You do. You absolutely do. How you doing?
Great. You know what an honor and privilege. I'm grateful, truly grateful to have this opportunity. First, to meet Pete. I've never met Pete. Nice talking to you. We've already had a nice little conversation. And Pete, yeah, you can buy the book on Amazon. It's on sale. There's used copies on sale already. So, you can buy those books, for Labor Day.
Wait a second. Hey, Pete,
can I buy a signed one?
I can sell you mine, and if you want, I'll change the name. Instead of Ray, I can scribble Pete on there.
That book will be on eBay by the time this podcast is over.
Yeah, that presupposes Guy Deddy read the whole thing, right? I mean, let's just don't answer that as your attorney, Ray. Don't answer that, okay? Take the fifth.
Very good point.
So no, I have had the great opportunity of working with Ray for years now, and I thought we co-authored a couple of police chief articles, but definitely one for sure.
Yes.
And all about intelligence-led policing. And I was brought on by our friend, Professor David Carter.
Amazing man. Yes.
He knows his business in intelligence-led policing, but I came on as the constitutional law lecturer with my background in police ethics and police misconduct. For a little bit of a background, I got my master's degree from Michigan State, and Professor Carter was my thesis professor.
Wow.
And it's the funny thing, because I don't know anyone who ever grew up thinking they were going to become a police misconduct lecturer or author or dealing with moral turpitude, but that's exactly what happened. Like I was late for a class in Michigan State, and I didn't have a topic. And so moral turpitude in policing became my topic. And I had to look up what moral turpitude actually was in regard to policing. And I heard on a couple of your, one of your shows, I can't remember, and one of you guys said something about some philosopher saying, look, there's two major points in your life: being born and when you find your purpose.
Right.
And I'm telling you that I found my purpose teaching at Wayne State. I was an adjunct, but I taught young kids policing 101, and then an advanced class, and then as well as when I started the training for the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, because then I knew when these cops would come up afterwards and say, we've never heard anyone talk about constitutional law the way you do. And I'm like, that's just the way I think, because I come from a family of lawyers and cops.
Right.
Okay. So I didn't have a real choice. Policing was not my vocation. I didn't know what I was going to do. And but my big brother's a police officer, and my father's a lawyer, and we have lawyers throughout the family. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But the bottom line is, once I figured it out and took my street experience on the east side of Detroit, that was Detroit Police Department back in the late 80s and 90s, working a scout car. And I had other responsibilities at DPD too. I was a public liaison, but I eventually learned all about how cops rationalize policy non-compliance in internal affairs. Trust me, you don't know that till you get till internal affairs. I did not want to go to internal affairs. I made my boss order me to go there because I was a union steward. Right. I used to be a union steward.
I saw that.
Here I am fighting with fighting with IA, trying to help cops out, and then within a couple of years, I'm now the prosecutor, one of the 3 prosecutors in internal affairs, and I thought, I don't want to do this, but that was a part of my path.
Wow.
And seeing how cops actually try to rationalize policy noncompliance. And I'm not picking on Detroit. Detroit had a lot of issues, and actually, Ray, as you may remember, I was chosen to do some training under the consent decree. DOJ sued the Detroit Police Department, and I was chosen to do some training of their middle managers.
How'd that go?
It was good. Look at the back of the book. We did a study on it. There's a study of that training where we had them answer questions before we started and then answer questions after. And, we took a lot of credit for that. As a matter of fact, I said in the book that there was an article in one of the local papers in Detroit saying how misconduct has gone down in Detroit, and they're giving credit to the consent decree as to why misconduct has gone down, and it has turned around in Detroit. They have different leaders, of course, since I was there. But, I like to take a little pride in that. I was a part of that training, and, consent decrees do work, bringing policies from the 60s up into the 2000s.
Right.
But the bottom line is, and it's funny because, Phil, Pete, we lost a good friend, Phil Raymer, this year from IIR. And he used to always try to introduce me. And then he would start talking about he's going to talk about constitutional law and police ethics, and their eyes, the police officers' eyes glazed over. And then finally I said, look, I'll introduce myself. And then all he said was, you know what? He's a former Detroit police officer who's going to come talk to you about constitutional law and deontological and teleological ethics. He's interesting and he's energized. Stay awake. And that was it. And I thought, okay, that's good, Phil. That I could work with. So that's how it all came about. And
hey, just one other piece, because I know it's listed you wrote about it in the book, when Carter actually sort of taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, why don't you come teach? And at first you're all excited about it. And then all of a sudden you start getting, not cold feet, but you're starting going, wait a second, what's this all mean? Tell us about that real quick.
Yeah, okay.
And I say that because... No,
you're right. You're absolutely right. You're right. Yeah. You're right. Who ever heard of 28 CFR Part 23 when you're a street cop?
Right.
Okay. And so here, David picks me to do this training and fill in after Russ Porter, my predecessor, had to move on to Washington, D.C. And so I go to one of our first trainings to listen to Russ, and I'm taking notes on legal pads, and I'm taking down everything he says. And then I go home after a couple of days, and I'm looking at, I'm like, competing hypotheses, inductive, deductive reasoning. And I call Carter. I said, what's that got to do with me? Well, what do you want? And he talked me off the ledge. And he said, look, just do your constitutional law, ethics, misconduct stuff, and talk about character. Because character matters. And we've been saying it, and you guys are street cops, and you know it matters. But the problem is it's going to matter more now than ever with the hiring crisis, the retention crisis. You've got this pandemic going around where, we've been sheltered in and whatnot, and tempers are shorter, and character matters. And so then I said, oh, you want to talk about constitutional law with ethics? And look, in the book, I don't mention deontological or teleological ethics, but it's in there, okay? Doing the right thing isn't working anymore as a platitude. I'm really against police platitudes, and we'll talk about that maybe, and it's in the book.
Yeah,
and
I say, so.
You hear a police chief say, well, we must have transparency and accountability.
What's that mean?
Well, how, Chief? Don't just put that on the nightly news, okay? How? And that's how this book came about. Phil bugged me to write this book. Phil's about the only person that ever read all of my Police Chief magazine articles. That's truly. Right. I think he's the only person who couldn't wait to get the copy and read them.
Yep.
And he said, why don't you put them in a book? I said, I'm not going to write a book. I mean, who's got time to write a book? So I thought, all right. So I let that go for a while. And then sure enough, we were sheltered in March 11th, 2020. And I said, well,
Time to write.
I've got all these lectures from Wayne State. I've got all these lectures from intelligence-led policing. I've got my street experience. I've got my internal affairs experience. I am a lawyer. We may not go out and train again. I'm going to reduce my thoughts, my lectures, down to a book of 11 chapters plus an introduction and a prologue, and just say, look, here's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I took the president's task force for 21st century policing as the foundation. And I put, as I say, I put the meat on the bones. And so, I trust that your audience is full of middle managers, those who are going to be chiefs in 7 to 10 years from now. They're going to be policymakers 7 to 10 years from now. And so that's who I write for. Now, this book is meant for both undergraduates and at the academy level. It's for next generation police officers and supervisors. But the bottom line is we are in a crisis, and we've got to take a step back. I don't even know if reform is the right word. I'm uncomfortable with that. What are we reforming? If constitutional policing is where we're going, and this is what I said in the book, and this is what I said to anyone who listens, Pete, Ray, what have we been doing for the last 30 years that I've been associated with policing? What have we been doing if we haven't been constitutionally policing? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know.
Good point. Yeah.
But I get it. So when I talk to my students or what I'm writing now, basically what I say is constitutional policing, in my humble opinion, is professional policing served legally, humanely, ethically, and respectfully. And you're going to say, well, that seems like there's a little overlap there. You might think there is. But the bottom line is each one of those has a different scenario in policing. Legally is one thing, but what does that presuppose, Ray? What does that presuppose, Pete? That your officers understand the Fourth Amendment. And look, I know in 1986 we were taught constitutional law, but it was how to get around the Fourth Amendment. We weren't taught the Fourth Amendment. That's not funny. Who's laughing? That's not funny. We were taught how to get around it. What were the exceptions? Trying to get consent and all of that, but we didn't talk about what is the Fourth Amendment all about. Unreasonable searches and seizures by government. So, all right, and the 14th Amendment and due process. Look, I'm not talking about that. That's not what this is about, and that's not totally what my book is about. But you can't educatedly talk about unconstitutional policing without laying the foundation for constitutional policing. So that's where we're starting.
Wow.
Well, let me just add then that. So then I found the task force. And I'm sure you guys have read it, but the task force was made up of police executives chosen by President Obama back in 2015, and they put together recommendations and action items for us to move forward. 21st century policing. We're not looking backward, even though I know we're relentless follow-up. Look, that's to make sure our policies are working and our people are doing what they need to be doing. My book is full of relentless follow-up. Yes. Really, it is, okay? But the task force put together a handful of recommendations, and any police chief or policymaker or your future police chiefs listening to this, you have to know your way around the president's task force, let alone IACP model policies, let alone what PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, puts out there. And you know why? Because plaintiffs' attorneys are going to know their way around them. Okay? I have a two-pronged goal in my training. And one is the constitutional law, constitutional policing, which is the legally, humanely, ethically and respectfully. But it's also the preventable lawsuits. And that's where I've combined.
That's the risk management.
That's the
right?
risk management. Exactly. All right. And look, my thesis back at Michigan State was the police legal ethics awareness training. And all I did was use Supreme Court cases to show the reader how cops got in trouble legally and ethically, not following the law, not following policies, not following the norms. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about norms and standards. The IACP has a white paper, I think it's on standards of conduct. As a police leader, whether you're a chief or policymaker or whatnot, if you don't know and have a model policy of standards of conduct and expectations in your manual, we all used to get binders. Remember, we all had binders back in the day. If you don't have that, you're one could argue you're grossly negligent as a leader. But either way,
but at the same time, and then you're a member of IACP, like you can't have both, right?
Oh yeah. I'm an associate. I'm an associate member.
Right.
Oh no, well, you can't have both. What?
What I'm saying is you can't join a professional organization that espouses these protocols, right?
Right.
And not follow them yourself. That's something.
Well, that's the gross negligence. No, and that's where the plaintiff's attorneys.
That's where it comes up on.
Puts it right in front of you, Chief, at your deposition.
That's right.
It's like, well, let's talk about your use of force policy. When was that last updated? Well, a couple of years ago. Well, is it? Are you a member of the IACP? Yes. Are you a member of IACP? No. Okay. Why aren't you a member of the IACP? Look,
right.
You know how lawyers are. They take your answers and they turn them around. Okay. So the point is, I guess the question begged to be asked is, who do you think those model policies are drafted for? They're not drafted for me. They're drafted for police chiefs and policymakers of police departments. Even if you're a chief of Smallville and you have 10 officers, why wouldn't you look to the IACP model policies and what PERF is putting out there in their white papers on use of force and de-escalation? If you're not training in de-escalation, you're grossly negligent. It's actually called deliberate indifference. If you're a police leader and you're making the decisions of what you're training in the academy and whatnot, if you're not training today in de-escalation of force and use of force continuums, you're deliberately indifferent if one of your officers injures a citizen and it's eventually adjudicated to be objectively unreasonable, which is a violation of the Fourth Amendment.
This concept would extend to model policies in the way you conduct certain types of investigations, whether they be sexual assaults or firearms or murder investigations. If there were model policies designed to say that you should tag these particular bases and you don't adopt them, would you be facing the same risk that you're talking about now?
Absolutely. Remember, they're asking these questions in interrogatories and depositions in civil lawsuits. We're just talking civil lawsuits. If it ever does get to trial, they're going to ask these questions of you, Chief, or of you, the policymaker who decides what we train in and what we don't train in our academy, or training in roll call. We have training in roll call nowadays. They're going to ask, do you follow IACP model policies for sexual abuse, sexual harassment in the workplace, homicide investigations? You talk your work in weapons and whatnot. There are model policies, and they're written, and it's the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's not for regular police officers. It's for the chiefs. So, look, know your craft, because I'm telling you, there are plaintiffs' lawyers out there who make a living suing police departments only, and especially, I can tell you, in Detroit for sure, they sue. There's a joke in the Detroit Police Department. We're self-insured. No one will insure the police department because that's what are you going to do? We just pay. It's taxpayers' money. And part of it, and let me just get into the risk management real quickly. It's not just the lawsuits that we pay out and settle or their jury awards. It's all of the manpower hours lost investigating police misconduct, and the hearings and the labor law hearings, and then we get a rogue officer fired, and then he appeals that to an arbitrator. Then we have to draft up a brief, and the other side, the union, drafts up a brief, and then the arbitrator says, well, you fired him, he's a good guy, but he did commit a pretty horrible sin, so we're going to give him a year off, but we're going to bring him back. It's like, we don't want him back. He doesn't get the calling. He doesn't understand the vocation of policing. It's public service. We don't want him back. And that's a problem that major cities, especially, you read about that in Minneapolis last summer, that they can't get rid of rogue officers because of unions and whatnot. I'm not blaming unions. I used to be a union steward. But what I'm saying is it's very difficult. And so what I put in this book was this concept of putting together norms and values for the nationwide. Look, we have an IACP code of ethics. We have an IACP oath of office. They're out there, but we shouldn't have differing values and ethics per agency. We are one profession. We are the police profession. In other words, what are our norms? What are our core values? Anyone? Do you guys? Am I putting you on the spot if I ask you what are core values in policing? What should they be? If you want to take that on.
Integrity.
All right. Perfect. All right. It's in my book. Okay. I use the term noble integrity, but I do that for a reason. I wrote a police chief article a couple of years ago. I can't remember. I said, look, doing the right thing isn't working anymore because it's too subjective. We all bring different moral compasses to the job. We all do. Some of us have two parents. Some of us have one parent. Some of us have no parents. Some of us have religion. Look, we all have different moral compasses that we bring to the job. It's our duty as policymakers in policing is to make sure our recruits all agree on what the core values are of the profession, not of our individual agency, but of our profession. And that's why I broke it down in, I think, chapter 3 to noble integrity. Now, I'm not saying you got to go out there and have a sergeant show up at a scene and say, now, was that a noble thing to do? What I'm saying is changing the mindset of policing for the future. We're talking about 21st century, the next generation, of doing the noble thing, because there's very little subjectivity on what the noble thing is in policing, in public service.
Well, hey, Tom, just real quick though, with 18,000 law enforcement organizations in the United States, is it difficult to have that professional ethic that is sort of agreed upon? Like, do we have to build that out? To your point, it's not just about your organization now. It's about the law enforcement discipline.
I'm talking about the profession. Absolutely.
Right.
And the IACP's got to adopt this. And I'm not saying adopt what I'm saying. Adopt what the task force is saying. Okay, these are recommendations from 5 years ago. I don't know if they've come to fruition or not. I don't, but I took and let me just read this because I don't memorize this stuff, but they have an action item that says the DOJ is to disseminate case studies as examples of past injustices. That was one recommendation. 2, expand research and data collection to know what works and what doesn't work in policing. And 3, law enforcement undergraduate programs, they provide a serviceable foundation, but do not come close to addressing the needs of 21st century law enforcement. That's the task force 5 years ago. I took those and wrote a book and said, let's figure out what our professional core values are. And I didn't start from scratch. I didn't start once upon a time we had core values. They're in the IACP Code of Ethics. They're already in the oath. And let me just say something before I forget. I have yet to find an oath of honor or oath of office better than the Atlanta Police Department. I'm not going to get into it. Have your audience Google the Atlanta Police Department oath of office, because it is very involved. It's not long, but it's involved and it talks about constitutional policing duties. It talks about state constitutional policing, but it also says we incorporate the International Association Chiefs of Police Code of Ethics. So then it covers all of that. That says I won't tarnish my agency. I'll keep my private life unsullied as an example to all. And it encompasses that. And I bring that up. I bring it up because the state of Georgia has a felony for the violation of the police oath. Okay? I did not know that. When I was doing my research, while we were COVID locked up, they have a felony, a 1 to 5 year felony that says if an officer is adjudicated to have violated his or her oath of office, they are convicted of a felony and go to prison 1 to 5 years. And that's important because in GBI down there, they will charge the officer with a criminal. It's got to be basically criminal actions, okay? They'll charge them. Let's just say, for example, it's felonious assault and the violation of the oath. It's my understanding that they go through a whole trial and a jury, the juries back in the day, Ray, Pete, they used to give cops the benefit of the doubt. We're not getting that anymore, but not totally. But the jury decides, in my hypothetical, they decide that there just wasn't enough evidence regarding policies and procedures and the facts to convict the officer on the underlying primary charge of felonious assault. But then they can still convict the officer on the violation of oath of office. So you're still charged with a felony, convicted of a felony. You lose your job, you lose your pension, you could lose your freedom. That's pretty strict. And GBI down in Atlanta, they are getting rid of rogue officers in the state, and it's working. And I say that to you and your audience is because, look, does your state have that statute? Most don't. Michigan has a statute that's a 5-year felony. It says misconduct in office, but that's the primary charge, misconduct in office, not the additional sentence enhancer violation of oath. Times are changing in policing. They are changing. All right, we're not going to even talk about qualified immunity today, but the bottom line is times are changing and we have got to clean up the profession when it comes to reforming the mindset of next generation cops. I'm not talking about the 20-year veterans. They've been around long enough. They're still using 1980 policing maybe. I don't know. I'm not chastising the profession. I love policing. I love the profession. But my book and my lectures and what I write for Police Chief Magazine is looking forward. And it's for command leadership. And it's for command leadership to look back with relentless follow-up, making sure that whether they come up with new policies or they're just using IACP model policies, that character matters. Character matters as a defense in civil cases. If you are a straight up cop and you made a mistake, juries can sense that. Justice Scalia even said, look, the law is there to protect cops who use good faith. What is good faith? How do you define good faith? In my book, you don't have a personnel file that's an inch thick full of complaints and allegations of brutality and abuse of sick time, and you're constantly late. And that's someone who doesn't want to be a police officer or shouldn't be a police officer.
100 people can't be wrong, right?
Yeah. So, look, character matters more now than ever, especially, and I say this all the time in training, we can only now, at this juncture in the profession, hire the best who show up. We can only hire the best. Look, we used to, back in our days, we hired the best of the best. And it was a calling. And we held ourselves to a higher standard. At least the three of us did. I can't speak for everybody. I know my brother did. I know my partner did. But, we did. We took that for granted. So, I talk about in the book, shame. the younger generation, I think we've lost track of shame. Where you don't want to get jammed up, it's a shameful act. It doesn't have to be illegal, but it's a shameful act. Then that's where you tarnish your agency's reputation. You tarnish. I sat on the IACP's Police Image and Ethics Committee for years. And we always talk about ethics and the ethics toolkit. They have an ethics toolkit. If you don't know that, you can use that. But eventually, our chairman Ron McBride was our chairman for years, and he would finally say, we had a 3-day conference in the biannual meeting, and he would say, "Look, people, we have to get back to the image. All right, this is the Image and Ethics Committee. Let's talk about the image of the profession and protecting the image." And that's where I talk about in the book all the time about seeing the big police picture. Okay, officer? It's not about just you out in the patrol car, in the dark alleys, doing whatever you want to do, especially when everybody's got a video camera today. How about just doing your job?
Tom,
Yeah.
As you're speaking, I have some dog-eared marks in your book, and
Okay.
early on you talk about, and I want to read this. I said I don't want to read this out loud, but I'm going to try to paraphrase it to sort of tease out some pieces that I'd like you to comment on. And you talk about how, as most of us know, the enforcement of the law is not an exact science, nor was it ever intended to be. It is meant to be philosophically adaptable to society's evolving and maturing needs in public service measures from and for the police. Our forefathers never contemplated Fourth Amendment privacy issues addressing cell phone tracking or the use of drones, thermal imaging devices, facial recognition hardware to thwart crime. Nor did they figure Second Amendment case law would eventually have to address automatic weapons that can fire hundreds of rounds a minute, or that the Eighth Amendment would lead to protecting convicts' rights in prisons. This is precisely why the Bill of Rights was drafted, to act as a philosophical guiding document for future societal interpretations, exceptions, and ever-evolving technological advances. So, as a backdrop, that is the backdrop. What I'm hearing you say is that not just your book, but what your message is that we need to leverage, maybe that's the bad word, we need to utilize the Constitution to help us navigate through the evolving, the evolution of society, right, and technology. But if we don't evolve and we're caught back in a distant time, what we might have practiced then, which might have been considered professional policing, is not professional today. Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely. Look, back in the day, it's my understanding, you could not burn the American flag. We arrested people for burning the American flag. We arrested women for going to abortion clinics. Okay? Society's needs change. And that's why the law is philosophical. And that's why policing is philosophical.
Wow.
Look, I talk about all the time in my training, I talk about a Supreme Court case that has nothing to do with policing. I forgot what it actually was about, but I quote this justice who says, look, the Constitution was never, and the Bill of Rights really, was never meant to be a suicide pact. It wasn't meant to be black and white. It's about interpretation. And that's what the Supreme Court does, is interprets the law, precedent, and what's going on in society today. And all I say is the bottom line is our recruits at the academy level, our undergraduate criminal justice students, they have to appreciate how the Constitution changes policing policy and procedure. And look, they don't have to master it. They have to just appreciate it. I even have relatives who ever said, oh, the Constitution, it just gets in the way. I mean, really. I said, you know what? If you actually know how the Constitution works, and you have trainers who talk about the Fourth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of due process and equal protection, you can enhance your policing skills when it comes to making arrests, when it comes to writing reports, when it comes to making a case stick. I'm not talking about embellishing. I'm talking about knowing what the Constitution says, understanding reasonable cause, reasonable suspicion, probable cause. Look, I don't want to get into all that, but what the point I try to make in the book, and I try to reinforce every time I do speak or I'm interviewed or I lecture, is that the task force has come forward and said, look, we know there's the legal. We know there's the warrior mindset. We get that. But there's a balancing, and the balancing is the guardian mindset. And generally speaking, guys, you both were cops. Most of us have to use the guardian mindset in every citizen interaction. I worked in a very difficult precinct back in the day. We had a couple of patrol areas that we had to have 2 cars assigned to it because it was so dangerous. And if we had a felony run, 2 cars had to go in there together. We had to wait to go in together. Okay, yeah, policing is a dangerous business. Nobody's saying it's not. But the task force, these police executives, wrote time and time again how, number one, we've got to work on more constitutional law training. And that's where I come in with the unconstitutional policing and using case law by describing how cops got in trouble and got jammed up and got fired or went to jail doing their job. But they also said we have to work on the guardianship part of relationships. Now we're talking about community policing. We're talking about community-oriented policing services. All you future, you middle managers out there, read what COPS is printing about community policing and de-escalation and community policing and community relations and trust and legitimacy. How are you going to establish that with some of the scenes that we saw last summer? And I'm not chastising anyone for what happened last summer, but we have a trust issue and a legitimacy issue. And so I looked at the task force. So what they're saying is, look, there's 2 sides. There's a balancing. Yes, you have to be always ready as the warrior. You always have to be ready. You never know. As a matter of fact, for my Wayne State class, I used to use an acronym, STIR, straight from Supreme Court. STIR, split second, tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving. If the situation is split second, stressful, tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving, look, we hope you use your training. We hope you use your experience, but we're not going to second guess you so that you got to keep looking over your shoulder when you may have to use your weapon or a taser or whatnot. But most of our interactions with our community, our citizens, are non-STIR. They're not split second, tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving. We're talking to these individuals. And that's where the respect comes in at traffic stops. And you'll see in the task force, when I know both of you are going to go get your copy of the task force for 21st century policing after this. And they talk about procedural justice. Now, I'm not comfortable with the term procedural justice because I used to teach, 18 and 19-year-old kids. And I'm like, so I use the term participatory accountability. It's a lot easier for me to teach participatory accountability. And it's and if you both have degrees in criminal justice, I know Pete, you do, right? Was it who's the father of policing over in England? Oh, Peel, Robert Peel.
Robert Peel.
The people are the public and the public are the police.
Yes.
We're supposed to be equal. We're supposed to be approachable. We're not supposed to have these egos and this authoritarian, condescending attitude, whether it's toward minorities or anyone else. We're public servants. And what the task force, I read between the lines. They don't say this specifically. But what I read between the lines is, look, we got to get back to this guardianship mentality where we're just one-on-one. If you make a traffic stop, explain to the citizen why the traffic stop, why there is a law regarding whatever they stopped you for. Get their proper identification if there's no outstanding warrants or whatnot. The task force says, stop the numbers game. Stop making police productivity all about arrests and civil infractions. We're getting in trouble when that's how we measure productivity. Advise your citizens. If it's a broken taillight, if it's the fuzzy dice hanging from the mirror, advise them. We have that's a civil ordinance here in the city. I could give you a ticket, but I'm not gonna. They also have in the task force the idea of handing out your business card. And I don't submit having the officer's name on the business card as much as the officer's precinct number, maybe the supervisor's desk's number, and you give them the card and you say, if you felt that I was at all unprofessional in this interaction, please give a call to this number. It's about accountability. Where I said earlier, I don't like platitudes. Don't tell me, Chief, about transparency and accountability. How are you going to be accountable? How are you going to make your officers accountable for their actions out on the streets when no one's looking?
So, what advice would you give an aspiring police chief when you talk about we've got to change our image? We've got to focus more on guardianship than being warriors. What would you recommend that they look at? What types of things?
Well, definitely the task force. Look, let's do this, Pete. I'll be the plaintiff attorney, and you be the police chief, the up and coming police chief who's now sitting in a deposition. Have you read the president's task force for 21st century policing?
No.
Why not? It was written for people like you. Okay, let's change it. Let's go back again. Have you read the
it was
president's?
I think you know what? I think it was a political thing. The group was stacked politically to make a political point.
Okay, and now we are here in a lawsuit where two of your officers are charged with excessive force and brutality. And that task force talks about brutality and excessive force and training and guardianship. And at this juncture, I'm not a plaintiff's attorney. I've never sued. I used to be a probate attorney, actually. So I've never sued police departments. I've never defended police departments. But I'm going to look over at the jury and I'm going to roll my eyes and I'm going to say, really? You've never read the task force for 21st century policing, and yet that's who it's written for. It's written for you. Do you follow the IACP model policies? Do you follow PERF? Do you follow cops? Why not? It's your job. It's your duty. So I'm telling up and coming, in your hypothetical, what would I tell up and coming chief wannabes or commanders or colonels or captains or policymakers in the academy level who decide what we train in and what we don't? Check out the president's task force. Check out IAC model policies. Become a member of the IACP. Go to the annual conference. We have a conference in 2 weeks in New Orleans, hopefully, that you go to the panels, you go to the workshops. That's what this is about. Know your craft. Because the plaintiff's attorneys are going to know it. I'm telling you, they're going to know it. And they're going to go ahead.
So we're playing a role here, and I'm going to play the role of the excuses that I've heard.
Okay.
When I've asked them about putting policies in place, and it's like, well, we don't have money to buy gas for our cars. I don't have the budget. The powers to be in the appropriators aren't giving us the money that we need to do our jobs.
I understand.
What's your
response? That's why we now have roll call training. We're doing roll call training in police departments around the country where they actually take an extra 10 minutes and I submit you talk about constitutional policing. Like, for example, we had an acronym back in DPD for report writing. It was arrest. It was ASCOT: arrest, source, circumstances, other, and taken. And I submit that you add in an extra C, constitutional circumstances. What were the constitutional circumstances for you to conduct that search? What were the constitutional circumstances for you to even stop that pedestrian walking down the street? And if you start training in the constitutional circumstances at the academy level and through your FTO training, eventually we're going to have cops years from now thinking constitutional policing. When they go to draft up the arrest report, the police report, they go to draft up the warrant request. And then they're going to be comfortable testifying, whether it's in open court in criminal cases or even civil matters. Then they don't have to be lawyers. Look, I wrote this book. I took all the legalese out of it. I tried not to use legalese as best I could without writing a book about the law and ethics. But the bottom line is, if we start indoctrinating now the concept of constitutional policing and what it's about, and putting it in our police reports and putting in your roll calls, it takes nothing, Pete, nothing, Chief Pete, to do 10 minutes of constitutional discussion, constitutional policing, after you've put out the bulletins and after you've read what's going on and after all of the business that we have in roll call. You take 10 extra minutes and you talk about, look, don't shoot at moving vehicles. We have a policy. Don't shoot at moving vehicles. Okay.
Well, I'll
Any
tell you.
questions?
I'll tell you what I tell people.
Okay.
And I totally agree with what you just said, because really it all comes down to you gotta wanna. If you wanna, you'll find a way. For example, none of us have $20,000-$30,000 just sitting around just in case the hurricane blows a tree down on the roof of our house. But when that happens, we find a way to fix that hole in our house. Right. Or else the weather, the rain, the wind is going to come in and destroy our house. So we might not have the budget readily available to fix the roof, but we find a way. Whether we get up there ourselves and we put a tarp over it, whether we get some neighbors together, whether we borrow the money from a bank, we're going to fix the roof on our house. So what I tell people is, money is not the object when it comes to doing the right thing.
Right. No. Look.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
I hear you in this conversation with Pete, particularly the role playing. I hear you coming from sort of two directions here. The first, and I'm going to refer to your book, where you talk about the big police picture is about minimizing risk and honoring oaths, right? That's the big one. Courts rule on the law and provide guidance as to legal policing measures. It's incumbent that policymakers and risk managers take those legal rulings and shape department policy in order to reflect the laws, the promises, the disciplinary sanctions, and deterrence needed to keep cops out of the criminal and civil courts. That's the you gotta wanna piece, right? That Pete's describing. Then there's the tactical side, what I'm hearing you say, where officers themselves, line level personnel, mid-level, they have to understand the application of the law by understanding case law, by understanding constitutional issues. That's what I'm hearing you saying. I completely agree with it. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. Let me just add to that. The officers you just talked about, they don't need to know the constitutional law. They need to have a very good understanding or a healthy appreciation for constitutional law. But that's why I write, and I've been lecturing since my master's degree on the dark side of policing. It's so much easier to say, don't do this because the Supreme Court said it's wrong. It's illegal. It's unethical. It's an objectively unreasonable force. Don't do this. I have a whole slew of cases on tasers where, look, the taser policies were just all over the place for the last 15 years. They just have been. And the bottom line is there's lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit of officers who abused tasers. And so my book has very little to do with fatal force. because that, again, that's, stressful, tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving. But tasers, using the use of tasers and the abuse of tasers, the law is full of officers being fired, being suspended, lawsuits, cities and taxpayers paying thousands of dollars for officers who have abused the tasers. All right. And I use a case, and I don't want to get into it because it's pretty involved, but it's in the book. It's called Kingsley versus Hendrickson. Came out in 2015, right around when the task force actually issued their final report. And it's a great case, and not a lot of my understanding is we're not using it in training right now. But the bottom line is, and despite the fact that it's a jail pretrial detainee case, the Supreme Court said they've expanded the definition of objective unreasonableness from Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. Now, I know you gentlemen are familiar with Tennessee versus Garner, Graham versus Connor. We've been using it for 40 years, 30 some years. Officers will be judged by the reasonable officer standard, the facts and circumstances confronting the officer at the time he or she used the force. We're not going to use 20/20 hindsight to say, well, they could have done this, they could have done that. That's all Graham versus Connor and Tennessee versus Garner. Under Kingsley and Hendrickson, despite it being a pretrial detainee case, the Supreme Court said, the majority said, we're going to add on a couple more considerations that judges and juries must look at when trying to define objectively unreasonable force. And they added on the severity of the injury. And more importantly, they added on de-escalation and whether the officers actually tried or considered lesser force. Now, you want to talk about evolving societal issues, Ray, Pete. There it is. That's a Supreme Court case.
Wow.
And I don't want any of my critics coming back saying, but that's a pretrial detainee case. It's a 14th Amendment case. It started as a 14th Amendment case. It ended where the majority said, we're using Graham versus Connor, which is applicable to street policing and privacy and Fourth Amendment. And we're talking about seizures now for those of you. Fourth Amendment is unreasonable search and seizure, which then falls under force. And in Kingsley, they said, here are two more things. Even though there are other things that can be considered, here are two more things we believe juries, who used to give us the benefit of the doubt, and they're not giving it to us as much anymore, can consider when deciding objectively unreasonable force, which is police brutality or excessive force. Severity of the injury, and did they consider lesser force options? There's de-escalation right there, and it's in the book, Ray. I know you've got a tab on it. I'm not going to ask you about it. We're not going to get, okay? But we have got to be training in Kingsley versus Hendrickson, because what they're basically saying is, if you read between the lines, SCOTUS is saying, in looking at objectively unreasonable force, we're going to look at what any government actor and his coulda, shoulda, woulda. I use coulda, shoulda, woulda. Could he use force? Maybe. Should he use force? Probably not. What would a reasonable officer have done in that situation? And we're going to look at, the force itself, the threat. Were they attempting to flee? And so there's this whole litany. Even taser itself. IACP has its model policies on tasers, and PERF has its model policies or white papers on tasers and de-escalation. But the bottom line is, the taser company says, do not tase juveniles. Do not tase pregnant women. Do not tase the elderly. And do not tase the handcuffed. And those are all in my book. Every one of those examples. Google it, Pete, as soon as we're done here. Google a great-grandmother tased by police. There's a case out there a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago now. He tased her over a traffic ticket. She wouldn't sign the ticket. So he had her name, he had her address, he had her license tag, he had all the information. She wouldn't sign the ticket. So egos escalated. I refer to that as unilateral cop escalation, because the officer said, well, use of force continuum said I could use my taser because she resisted arrest. Well, why were you arresting her? Well, she wouldn't sign the ticket. So what? You've got her address. You know where she lives. Why would taser in their policies, why would IACP, why am I yelling? Why would IACP say in their model policies, don't tase the elderly? I don't know. They fall, they break an arm, they break a hip, they could die, and then we get sued, and you and your superiors are going to go to court and say, hey, he was within policy. Okay, that's what in risk management we call that lawful but awful. Lawful but awful. Okay, it's egos. That officer allowed his ego to get, and then they settled the case. She sued for 40 grand. I don't know who he worked for, but I imagine $40,000 of taxpayer money paid to this lady, this 70-year-old lady, could have been used in another fashion. And that's risk management. Stopping the lawsuits, preventable lawsuits. Look, the book is about getting rid of rogue officers. I'm not saying we're going to clean up policing overall. Like they say, you don't eat the whole pizza. You take one bite at a time, okay? If we could concentrate in our training and at the undergraduate classes and in our, I talk about training, FTOs, oversight by FTOs, supervising, retraining, and discipline. We miss the discipline part, okay? But what I'm trying to get at is if we were to concentrate on the four major sins in policing and lawsuits, police lawsuits: excessive force, police brutality, lying, conduct unbecoming, which are egregious acts of policy noncompliance, and domestic violence. If you could focus in your agency on deterring lying, and I'm talking about lying as we discussed before on arrest. I tell my students way back, you draft up an arrest report that may end up at the Supreme Court someday. Be thorough. Be thorough. Be honest. Be thorough. But lying, excessive force, conduct unbecoming, and domestic violence. That was if I tried officers on domestic violence I tried supervisors on domestic violence and internal affairs, and I thought, really, you're going to beat up the loved one and plead guilty in a court of law? And then they came to our trial boards, and we had to have a trial board, and then we had to take their gun away for the 6 months, or the court took their gun away for 6 months. Then we had to find somewhere to put them for 6 months on a desk. How can you have domestic violence charges of police public servants and then expect them to go out in the dark alleys and the crack houses and whatnot and have composure and with total strangers? So look, character matters. In my book and in my lectures.
Tom,
Yep.
Tom, you've said throughout this last hour, I've heard you talk about model policies and looking at it from a relentless follow-up. What I find that, and Pete and I have talked about this. Pete has this the vivid picture of the three-legged stool: people, processes, and technology. And to me, the processes, that's policies are aligned on that leg of the stool. But what I recognize is that you have to have these policies, but it takes the people to make sure that the policies are being adhered to. There's nothing worse than having a policy in an organization and finding out because of some critical incident that occurs that people were not following them. And that's where I believe the RF factor, that looking in the rearview mirror, is critically important. So my question to you is, if you have insight or advice, or maybe I shouldn't use counsel because you might charge us here, But that was a
Good.
joke. That was a
I
joke.
got it. It was a lawyer joke.
Yes, it was. To inoculate an organization, it starts with a model policy. You have training towards that policy to make sure it's understood and applied. And then thirdly, it has to be constantly evaluated, right? That's the inoculation piece. It's not just, oh, we have a policy on this. Here you go.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in my experience, and this is my humble opinion, in the years I've been associated with policing, I truly believe good cops want policies. They want the system to work. It makes their lives easier. And good cops are yearning for that leadership. And so my whole point is, if you start to indoctrinate the concept of constitutional policing, legally, humanely, ethically, respectfully, and guardianship, and you talk about participatory accountability, and you talk about, in roll call, in training, whether in the old days, sergeants and lieutenants used to go out and have lunch with the guys on the shift, and you talk, what's going on? What do I expect out of you? And then you follow up. Your relentless follow-up is the training and roll call. And then look, if an officer makes mistakes, and we all make mistakes, admit the mistakes. Look, in chapter 4, I think I write about intelligence-led policing, as you well know. And we have, in 28 CFR Part 23, hierarchical accountability. It all ends with the chief. Don't tell me, well, that cop knew better. He had training. He should have known better. Sorry, chief. You're the chief. And that goes to the lieutenant. It goes to the sergeant and the middle managers. You're all accountable. Accountability in intelligence-led policing goes up. And that's exactly how the system is meant to work. So if you put together, good cops want good, strong leadership so they can see the way. And it's not ambiguous. And it's not ambiguous if you're constantly talking about constitutional policing and noble integrity and what we expect out of you. And don't shoot at moving cars. And don't get involved in conduct unbecoming, where you bring discredit to the agency and it's shameful behavior because you were a cop. And domestic violence and lying. Okay? You constantly indoctrinate that and talk about it. And there are cases every week of police misconduct or whatnot on the internet. If they're true, bring them up, talk about them. You see where that cop did this the other day over in, Florida or whatever? Don't do that. Don't get jammed up. There's a perfect example. You see, I use the negative. I come from the dark side of policing. Don't do this, and then the cops have notice. The law is about notice. Then they have notice, oh, we probably shouldn't engage in that behavior. Okay, I get it. Oh, don't tarnish the agency's image. Oh, all right, I understand what that means. It's not a concept now. Now there's meat on the bones of it.
So I have one last question.
Okay.
Body cameras, good, bad, indifferent.
Well, it's about accountability. You want to talk about participatory accountability. The bottom line is we got ourselves here. We brought this on ourselves. And I say that because years ago, I swear, years ago, they put cameras in our patrol cars. When I was a police officer, they were about to. I was moving on in my legal career and got married, had a little baby, and I was moving on. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to have locators in the cars and cameras in the car now. It takes all the fun out of policing. So I thought, oh, what are we coming to? But you know what? We brought this on ourselves as a profession, and but in the flip side, just as the Supreme Court says, if you use good faith, it deters misconduct. So the body camera, if you're a straight up cop, a cop's cop, and you're doing your job professionally the way it was meant to be, it's all good. You have nothing to hide. I say in the book, we live in a big brother society now. Everybody has a camera, and there's security cameras all over. Just do your job. Tell the truth. Follow the policies and procedures. Follow the law. Be ethical. That's your job. That's your vocation. That's your passion. Just be a good cop, and you'll be fine. We all make mistakes, admit the mistakes, but the bottom line is if you try and follow the straight and narrow, you'll be fine. It's a great profession. It's a great calling. Public services, it's a great thing. We've got to get more people out there. But look, it's not brain surgery. It's about character.
Wow.
Well, the police is the only thing between the public and criminal impunity. And they're absolutely needed in any society, and we got to love them for it.
We do. And
Wow.
thank them every time we see them. Thank them for their service, because it's tough. It is tough right now.
So Tom, I have sort of one last question, but maybe it's more, again, teasing out some insight, and to sort of end on a positive note. Clearly, we're not in any way tearing down the profession as much as it's probably, I mean, it's not the only profession, but it's one of those professions that has to be at its, because of what it does and the nature of it, it has to be at the highest level. So it's important that we police our own. But I think it starts with the individual itself. It starts with that introspection. So what are your guidance for that young line officer, that person that's aspiring to come into the organization? How do they build that character? How do they ensure that they adhere to character so they know what the right thing is? And before you answer that, what I found in my career, it's usually not the mistake that the officer makes. It's how they go back and cover it up, because they're embarrassment. It's that shame piece. They're embarrassed that they did this, so now they got to go back and they got to, create some sort of a story around it that gets them in trouble. So how do we, ending on a positive note, how do we instill character in folks coming up through the ranks?
Look, I've had relatives for years when I came out of Michigan State's master's program, and they said, you can't teach ethics. And there's a quote from Socrates. I can't remember it exactly. He goes, no, I can't teach it, but I can talk about it. Okay. And the bottom line is there's a right and there's a wrong. And we get back to our own moral compass. And what people, when they ask or would say you can't teach ethics, you're right. We hire different people. We do our best to do our screening and whatnot. But we can tell them what the profession's core values are. We can tell them what we expect. We can give them examples of how it works, just like the task force said, and what doesn't work, unconstitutional policing. So they have a way of saying, I get it. And now you see this issue of intervening. Now they want to hold cops accountable for those who they didn't do anything wrong, but they also didn't stop their colleague and didn't intervene. That takes moral courage. And so we teach that. And so it's for the young recruit, the bottom line is, look, it's public service. You came to a calling. You love the idea of being a police officer to serve. And if you bring that humility that the task force talks about, the compassion, the empathy to the job under the guardianship, you'll do just fine. But our police leaders have to lay the foundation of not just the training, but the supervision, the retraining. And if it really gets egregious, they have to have the discipline. They've got to tell them, look, in the academy, we will fire you if you lie. Look, we have Brady Giglio lists out there now for cops who lie. They can't testify anymore. We got ourselves in a jam. Now we got Brady Giglio lists all over the country. So I would say if I was a chief, I'd come in the first day and go, thank you very much. I'm glad you're here. Really appreciate it. It's a great job. Don't lie or we'll fire you. Do not engage in domestic violence or we will fire you. But as far as, and as a young kid, I'm sitting in the academy. I'm like, why would I lie? I was dumb. Why would I ever lie? Why would I why would I hit anyone I love? So I get it. Look, we like to think they bring a great moral compass to the job. What I'm saying to you is let's all agree what the core values are. I have some in my book. I use noble integrity, but let's use the IACP code of ethics. Let's use the code of the oath of honor, the oath of office, and say, look, this is how we expect you to behave this out on the street because nobody's looking. Do the noble thing and you'll be just fine.
Tom, that was fantastic. I want to give another plug to your book. Where folks, not that we haven't spoken about your book,
right?
Where could folks find this book?
Yeah, it's all over anywhere you buy books online, but definitely Amazon. It's real hot on Amazon right now, and like I said, there are used copies already for sale on Amazon, and then Barnes and Noble for sure.
And where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, I have a website.
Okay, what's your website?
It's on the book. It's on the book. It's Thomas, all one word, thomasjmartinelli.com.
And that'll be in the show notes too, by the way.
Okay, right. The show notes, and then in there, I've got all of my police chief articles that I've written over the last 20 years, the stuff you and I've done, and so there's just a whole litany of stuff if you really want to get into this side of policing. And
you actually do training out there too for agencies or organizations that.
I was till COVID, and I'm still with IIR. I'm still with the Institute of Intergovernmental Research, and so we're working on constitutional policing right now, training. And so, can't wait to get back. Let's get rid of this pandemic and meet in person because that's just you learn so much by talking to cops who are actually out in the field doing it. You really do.
Well, I will tell you, Tom, you're just as energetic virtually as you are physically. So
good,
right, Pete? Yeah,
I'm mesmerized, man. I could just.
I love it. I love it, and it's just my little contribution to the profession.
Wow, Tom, I can't thank you enough for coming on board with us today. We really appreciate it, and you did provide a lot of insight for our viewers here.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ray and Pete. I'm grateful, truly grateful that I get this platform to talk about what I'm passionate about. So thank you very, very much.
Awesome. Have a good night, okay?
Welcome.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Good night.
What do you think, Pete? Huh? Good guess?
Wow. Yeah. I really like that that concept about being held, having your feet held to the fire to follow model policies of your organization, like the International Chiefs of Police, in terms of the type of the steps you might be taking to investigate various crimes. I mean, look, we've talked about, I've had cops tell me that when they got to the scene of a shooting and there's fired cartridge cases on the ground, that they kicked them down into the sewer. When the model policy says that's crime gun intelligence, you pick it up.
Yeah, pick it up.
Right. And you put it and you process it through NIBIN and the tools that you have available. Maybe you swab it for DNA or process it for latent prints too.
Well, but that's why you heard me say that, the model policy, and they're all over the place, right? There are entities to go to for those model policy, IACP, PERF, even locally, there's entities within neighboring jurisdictions. You have these policies, but you got to train towards those policies, and then you got to follow up, make sure people are doing what the policies say they're doing, right?
Exactly. It was an education.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you again. It's all. I love how he describes that. The nobleness of the profession and how it's our responsibility. Folks that are, when I say even folks like us that have, that are retired, right? We still have a love for the profession, but people in the profession to make sure it stays at that high standard, to have that professional ethic that is, undergirded by values, and he described them.
What's that circular plaque over your shoulder there?
That is, it was actually hiding. I had some like papers there the other day, and I real quickly had to find something to hide my mess back there. So that's the crest from the investigations branch from the state police. That
I
was
see.
my former command. Actually, it looks pretty nice. Right?
So you're waving the flag a little bit, huh?
Yeah, of course, you have to,
You-
right?
You're sending out the bat sign to the
Yeah.
to the viewers who really know what that means. Because I've been trying to read it, I just can't read it.
Well, it's I still have the blue and gold going through me. 100-year anniversary for the New Jersey State Police this year, so it's still at my core. So it's nice to be part of that kind of history and tradition.
So
Not only
I guess
my
you
own organization, but the profession in general. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I was just saying that I guess you started at year 1, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I figured I'd say it before you said it about me.
I would never pick on you.
No, I know.
Yeah. Hey, Pete, thanks again for another great episode here.
I was just mainly listening. I mean, it was
awesome.
he was a very dynamic speaker. I think I hope a lot of people that tune in on us get to hear what he had to say.
Absolutely. Well, hey, we'll make sure of it. So
good.
Yeah, and look, we have 2 lawyers back to back. Imagine that, right? Between Bob Troyer and now Tom Martinelli, and learning a lot. Great insight from them.
Yeah, we better stop that before we get corrupted. So,
all right. Be safe. Have a great night. Okay.
All right, you too, Ray. See you later.